Well, thank you everyone for joining us today and welcome. My name is Kevin Travis. I am a science officer with California Ocean Science Trust. I see some both new and familiar names joining us today, so I'm happy to share a little bit about Ocean Science Trust. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to convening science expertise to accelerate progress towards a healthy and productive coast and ocean. For nearly almost 25 years now, we've helped bridge the gap between cutting-edge scientific research and sound ocean and policy management. Today's briefing is offered as part of our science services program for California lawmakers, of which I see, we have many representatives in attendance here today. This legislative science services program at Ocean Science Trust was created to bring science knowledge, solutions, and recommendations directly to the legislature to support your decision-making. I'm very excited about today's briefing, and it's in partnership with various state partners, including the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the California Ocean Protection Council, and California Sea Grant. So in a few short moments here, you'll hear from a fantastic lineup of speakers. This will include updates on the status of California's kelp forest, recent state actions, science investments, as well as 3 research lightning talks that will showcase current projects aimed to accelerate recovery now and in the years ahead. But first, we are very grateful to welcome the legislative sponsor of today's briefing, California Assemblymember Diane Papin, who represents California's 21st Assembly District and also chair of the Water Parks and Wildlife Committee. So I invite Assemblymember Papin to join me to kick off today's discussion with some opening remarks. Thank you for joining us, Assemblymember.
Well, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with all of you this morning. I'm assuming you have no problem hearing me.
That sounds great.
Okay, great. Good. Okay. Well, thanks so much for inviting me as chair of Water Parks and Wildlife, WPW as we like to call it. And in celebration of Earth Day, I'm really excited to talk about the importance of kelp forests. To say that they do double and triple duty is an understatement. I'm sure you all can agree with me about that the importance of kelp cannot be overstated. These marine ecosystems act as both nurseries and safe havens for countless marine species that vary from rockfish to starfish. Not only do they provide crucial habitat, they also sustain intricate food webs, providing for marine mammals and birds. Moreover, kelp forests play a pivotal role, which is extremely important in mitigating climate change, absorbing carbon and from the atmosphere at a rate rivaled by few other ecosystems, and they help reduce the impact of ocean acidification. Yet, regrettably, our kelp forests are under siege. There's sort of been a perfect storm of recent factors lately, which I'm sure you're all aware of: warmer water conditions, an increase in sea urchin populations are just some of the few things that have caused a rapid decline in kelp forests. The consequences of the decline can be felt throughout the entire marine ecosystem, destabilizing fisheries, compromising coastal protection, and accelerating climate change. California has prioritized restoration efforts, including many of the programs that you're going to hear about today. This entails not only implementing stringent conservation measures to safeguard the existing forests that we have, but also activity to restore degraded habitats through targeted interventions such as replanting initiatives and marine protected areas. It's my absolute pleasure to hand this over to the presenters so that they can begin telling us about all the ways we're going to save and revive kelp. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Assemblymember Papin. We appreciate your time this week and joining us for this exciting and timely briefing. And like you mentioned, we have a great lineup of speakers. So for the next 40 to 45 minutes, we will include a series of talks organized by really 2 parts. To start, our state partners, let me share my slides here. To start, our state partners will share an update on progress over the past few years and going forward. First, Michael Esgro from the Ocean Protection Council will provide a status update on California's kelp forest and highlight the Kelp Action Plan developed by OPC that has guided state progress. Next, Dr. Kristen Elsmore from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife will share a state of the science that has informed the current development of a kelp restoration and management plan. From there, Dr. Shauna O from California Sea Grant will give an overview of the kelp recovery research program and other science investments made in support of California's management efforts. So this will then set up part 2 of today's briefing. The most recent investment program from California Sea Grant, the Accelerating Kelp Research and Restoration, included 5 learn by doing research projects that were collectively awarded over $5.8 million. Today, you'll hear about 3 projects from 3 researchers. First, to kick it off, will be Dr. Jenn Caselle, from research biologist from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Then we'll turn it to Rosa Laucci, Marine Division Manager and Marine Biologist from the Tolowa Dee-ni Nation. And lastly, closing us out will be Tristin Anoush McHugh, a Kelp Project Director at the Nature Conservancy. So these are truly some solution-oriented projects, from developing forecast tools, building capacity within Indigenous communities, and all the way to in-water efforts to restore bull kelp forest in Northern California. So we'll hopefully have around 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. And at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see a Q&A function to submit those questions. So with that, I will invite Mike Esgro to join me, and he'll be our first speaker to kick off today's briefing. Over to you, Mike.
Great, thanks so much, Kevin. Good morning, everybody. Happy Earth Week. Thank you so much to Assemblymember Poppin and our partners over at the Ocean Science Trust for hosting this briefing on this really important topic. So I'm Mike Esgro. I'm a senior scientist at the California Ocean Protection Council. We are a cabinet-level state policy body whose mission is to protect California's coast and ocean. And I lead our biodiversity team, and I also have the privilege of serving as our agency's tribal liaison as well. So I'll kick it over to Kristen just to introduce herself briefly, and then I will continue on.
Thank you so much, Mike. Good morning, all. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Kristen Elsmore, and I'm a senior environmental scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. The department is responsible for regulatory development, enforcement, and management of our wildlife and the habitats upon which they depend. And I lead the kelp forest restoration and management work within California's coastal waters. While the Ocean Protection Council and the Department of Fish and Wildlife have different roles and responsibilities, there's critical overlap in priorities and action needed to protect California's marine natural resources, and most relevant for our conversation today, protecting kelp. So I'll hand it back over to Mike to get us started. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. So yeah, I'm really excited to kick off today's briefing by providing a very high-level overview of California's efforts to protect and restore these iconic kelp ecosystems. So next slide, please. So as the Assembly member pointed out in the beginning, California's kelp forests are among the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. Kelp provides a variety of different ecological functions and ecosystem services. And as we heard earlier, can also provide some of those climate resilience benefits as well. I think it's really important to point out that kelp ecosystems also hold tremendous cultural significance to California Native American tribes. But unfortunately, as we've heard, kelp is also under threat from climate change. So next slide, please. As a result of warming waters and other climate-driven impacts, including that explosion in populations of kelp-eating purple sea urchins, we lost over 95% of the bull kelp off of California's north coast between 2014 and 2019. And a loss that dramatic had a huge impact on the region's biodiversity and the coastal economy and culture. So you can see this dramatic decline here in the top panel of the figure on the right, which shows the extent of kelp canopy at the ocean's surface over time. And that dashed line you're seeing there indicates the onset of the marine heat wave in 2014. So as you can see there in that figure, recovery on the north coast has been extremely limited since 2019. And on the central coast and the south coast, the story's a little bit more complex. Kelp loss has been patchier and less widespread since the heat wave, but there are still some areas like the Monterey Peninsula that are showing concerning declines. Next slide, please. So in the face of these threats, I'm really proud to say that California is taking bold action to conserve biodiversity, build that climate resilience, and maintain ecosystem services on which these coastal communities depend. So in 2021, the state released a Kelp action plan that contains strategies and opportunities to address the kelp crisis more proactively. And so far, OPC has invested over $10 million to implement that action plan. That includes monitoring kelp forest ecosystem health, improving our scientific understanding of what's driving this issue, and testing out potential solutions. Next slide, please. So the Kelp Action Plan committed California to concrete actions in 4 major focal areas: research and monitoring, policy development, restoration, and community engagement. So I'll briefly walk through each of those 4 focal areas, and I want to highlight some really important accomplishments to date. Next slide, please. So in research and monitoring, we know that long-term monitoring is really critical for assessing kelp forest ecosystem health. So teams from universities across California, as well as community scientists too, have been in the water conducting scuba-based monitoring of these habitats across the state every year since 2019 as part of our state's long-term marine protected area monitoring program. We can also monitor kelp by looking from the sky as well at the extent of kelp canopy on the ocean surface. And we're really excited about a new project with UCLA where researchers are trying to improve our ability to do this through new high-resolution mapping that relies on remote sensing and machine learning technology that's rapidly advancing. And beyond the monitoring piece, state-supported science is really helping us identify potential solutions to this crisis. So a great example of that is a group of scientists from across the country that have created a seed bank of more than 1,700 different bull kelp genotypes, really helping to preserve the genetic diversity of this species into the future. Next slide, please. On the policy and management side, just last year, California launched the development of a groundbreaking new plan that builds on the action plan, takes a longer-term view. This is a statewide, ecosystem-based, and adaptive kelp restoration and management plan. You're going to hear more about that from Kristen in just a few minutes. But really, right now what I want to highlight is that the Department of Fish and Wildlife, in partnership with us at OPC, is working to ensure that this statewide plan, again, which builds on that action plan from 2021, is informed by the best available science, community input, and tribal perspectives. And something I want to highlight that's going to be a really important part of that plan and action in the interim is a first of its kind restoration guide that's based on cutting edge modeling. I think you're going to hear a little bit more about this from Dr. Caselle soon, but this guide really is going to help resource managers, funders, and other restoration practitioners make good science-informed decisions about when and where kelp restoration might have the best chance of success in a changing ocean. Next slide, please. We're also working to build out an on-the-ground or an in-the-water toolkit for kelp restoration. And one really exciting example of this that just wrapped recently was an unprecedented partnership-based restoration effort up on the North Coast that successfully engaged commercial red sea urchin fishermen, you can see in this picture here, to restore kelp at 2 sites in Mendocino County. And through this work, California is really quickly emerging as a global leader in kelp restoration. We've been really excited to now engage regularly with restoration practitioners from around the world, many of whom are facing these same issues, to share our best practices and lessons learned and learn from them in exchange. Next slide, please. So finally, I really want to emphasize that engagement with California Native American tribes and engagement with the coastal communities who have been most impacted by this biodiversity crisis are really essential components of our work here. So we've initiated early consultations and listening sessions with tribes to inform the kelp restoration and management plan. We're taking a new approach here where we really want to build in tribal perspectives into this kelp restoration and management plan from the ground up, rather than coming to them for consultation on, a draft document. So we're really excited about that. We've got some great input from tribes so far. And in terms of our engagement with coastal communities, I want to highlight some partnership with the recreational diving community at Casper Cove up in Mendocino and at Tanker Reef in Monterey County. These efforts have successfully engaged recreational divers to cull urchins And we've seen that that effort can be successful so long as it's focused and sustained over a particular area. And then more broadly, to inform the kelp restoration and management plan, we are working very closely with our partners at Sea Grant and Strategic Earth to engage a variety of different ocean sectors through a community working group that was established earlier this year. Next slide, please. So I'll conclude by saying that as we look forward, as we look to chart a course to resilience, we know that these twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss really require us to act with unprecedented urgency to protect and restore these vulnerable ecosystems. But on the flip side, we also know that kelp restoration is an emerging science with many unknowns. So to balance these issues, to balance these realities, we are really adopting what we like to call a learn by doing approach, where we're continuing this ongoing, meaningful engagement with our tribal partners, with coastal communities. We're working with scientists and community scientists to address remaining knowledge gaps. We are committed to supporting clear action and tangible action while our statewide management plan is being developed. And we're actually working to complete that management plan in an accelerated timeframe. So by doing all this through this learn by doing approach, I'm really confident that we're building out our portfolio of solutions. We're offering a lifeline to some of the most vulnerable parts of our coasts, and we're really working to ensure the resilience of these systems into the future. So I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Elsmore at the department, who will take us on a deeper dive into that kelp restoration and management plan.
Thanks so much, Mike. Kevin, if you go to the next slide, please. All right. So as Mike touched on, the department, in collaboration and with support from the Ocean Protection Council, is developing a statewide kelp restoration and management plan for giant kelp and bull kelp, which will provide a science-based framework for managing, protecting, and restoring kelp forests in the face of changing ocean conditions. We have an overarching goal to develop a robust, adaptive, and climate-ready approach to managing, protecting, and restoring our kelp forest ecosystems across the state. And ultimately, this plan will go to the Fish and Game Commission for consideration and adoption. Next slide, please. So the plan itself will build out a comprehensive management framework for the kelp resources across the state, incorporating restoration as a critical component of a suite of management options to ensure that the resource is sustainably managed into the future. This can be thought of as a fisheries management plan plus, in that it'll go beyond essential elements of a traditional fisheries management plan as defined in the Marine Life Management Act, and will include an adaptive kelp harvest framework, as well as a restoration toolkit and an overarching ecosystem-based management approach. Those latter two components, the restoration toolkit and an ecosystem-based management approach, are really entirely novel to a fisheries management plan. So to date, no state fisheries management plan has attempted to incorporate these considerations comprehensively, but such bold and innovative management strategies are really essential for meeting the urgency of our climate crisis. Next slide, please. So the department and the Ocean Protection Council have initiated a multi-pronged approach to developing the kelp restoration and management plan, which consists of a community working group, science advisory committee, and a tribal engagement strategy that's engaged through or integrated throughout the various channels. So including the community working group, science advisory committee, and government-to-government consultation, as well as tribal roundtable listening sessions that Mike had mentioned earlier. And this is in order to ensure that the development of the kelp restoration and management plan is grounded in the best available science and is responsive to the needs of California's Native American tribes and stakeholders across the state of California. Active partnerships and collaborations are underway with key state and federal agencies as well to ensure that the kelp restoration and management plan is facilitating streamlined and effective management across the state, including restoration upon implementation. This science-based community-driven development process for the kelp restoration and management plan was funded in the fall of 2022 and is well underway. I do want to highlight that the funding for this development process has been essential to ensuring that we are able to simultaneously develop the plan and support action that both informs the plan itself and works towards recovery in the interim. Next slide, please. So some milestones that we have here to date for the kelp, developing the kelp restoration management plan are we've secured funding, as I noted earlier, and the community working group, we initiated a solicitation process, established the group, and have been convening the working group to gather that input. And similarly, we have established and been convening the Science Advisory Committee to ensure that the plan is informed by that science. And our tribal engagement strategy has been underway since the very beginning. We've had tribal roundtable listening sessions, and then, as noted before, we have representatives from several California Native American tribes on both the community working group and the Science Advisory Committee. And I will also like to note that we are continuing advancement of kelp recovery and research to inform the plan itself. And so shortly, you're going to be hearing from upcoming speakers that are touching on recently funded work. And the outcomes of each of those projects will directly inform the kelp restoration and management plan and translate those into application with statewide implications. Next slide, please. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time, and I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Dr. Shauna O, who leads the California Sea Grant, and to talk a little bit more about our partnered efforts in advancing kelp recovery, research, and supporting the development of the kelp restoration and management plan. Thank you.
Good morning. Give me a second to share the slide. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak. I'm Shauna O, Director of California Sea Grant, and I'd like to thank Ocean Science Trust and Assemblymember Pappen for the opportunity to share with you what our program's been doing to help the state, specifically the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and Ocean Protection Council. You heard from both of them, and we've been working with them to restore and manage our iconic kelp forest ecosystem. I'd like to also acknowledge Leon Gua, our research coordinator, and Teresa Talley, our extension specialist, who've contributed to this presentation.
Quickly, Shauna, we see the presenter side of your slides if you want to do a quick switch on that.
Can you see? Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So do you see the second slide?
I do. Looks good.
Okay, great. So our program, just a real brief overview, is a federal university partnership between NOAA and 34 university-based state programs in every coastal state, including the Great Lakes, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Sea Grant is legislated actually to initiate and support programs in research, education, and outreach. For California Sea Grant, our funding partnership is with NOAA at UCSD Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the California Natural Resources Agency. So our mission is to provide the information, tools, training, and relationships needed to help California conserve and sustainably prosper from our coastal and marine environments. And we're able to accomplish this by collaborating with a range of local, state, regional, national, and even international partners to further the co-production and application of relevant evidence-based knowledge. The focus areas are where our program invests our funding, time, and efforts, representing where we work topically. Cross-cutting focus areas include themes like diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and access, and environmental literacy and workforce development that are foundational to all the work that our program does and applicable across these topical themes. It's sustainable fisheries, aquaculture, healthy coastal ecosystem, and resilient communities and economies. And as you've already heard from both Mike and Kristen, that the kelp restoration, the kelp crisis, and the effort to restore really cuts across all of these focus areas. So really it devastated, the decline has devastated coastal communities as well as the ecosystem, affecting not only fisheries, but also coastal recreation and tribal nations. And this gives us an opportunity to also address issues and goals in diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as education and workforce development. So as required by our legislation, Sea Grant uses a three-tiered approach to achieving our mission, which is research, education, and outreach. For outreach, we have programming and communications and extension. For research, we provide grants and funding to the larger marine and coastal community in California, facilitating scientific discoveries and the generation of new knowledge in response to key questions about California's ocean, coasts, and watersheds through competitively selected extramural research that has been reviewed for scientific merit and potential impact. For education, we transmit knowledge and skills through a variety of formal and informal training mechanisms, including fellowships, traineeships, internships, and apprenticeships surrounding policy, research, extension, communication, and even industry practices. For communications, we share generated information with targeted audience through a variety of media to create awareness and engagement that complements the research, education, and extension programming. And as for outreach, our team engages and builds relationship with coastal communities, key partners, to identify pressing problems and address them with new opportunities through research, technical assistance, and also outreach. So California Sea Grant has been contributing to kelp recovery in California by supporting and administering programs in research, education, and outreach, all intended to supply information to meet the priorities that you've heard from Mike and Kristen. So for kelp restoration, we've been doing this, and it's only been possible with our close collaboration with multiple partners across the state and few from out of state as well. So Sea Grant has partnered with Ocean Protection Council and Fish and Wildlife on the kelp crisis since 2020. You've mentioned Mike talk about a few of the projects. So we released the first research call for solutions-oriented research projects to protect, restore, and inform management of kelp forests statewide. OPC contributed about $750,000 for this competition, providing the non-federal match for Sea Grant's $1.35 million in research investment. The 6 research projects we funded address key questions for understanding drivers of kelp decline and restoration, including how to deal with urchin overgrowth, how to raise and outplant kelp to restore those ecosystems, and to identify and cultivate resilient strains of kelp, and then finally the creation of the spore bank to preserve genetic material that Mike alluded to. In addition to support, additionally to support state management efforts for kelp restoration, we expanded the state policy fellowship program to offer a 2-year extension fellowship for kelp management. So Fish and Wildlife, a person in Kristen's role, served as the host and one of the co-mentors for this fellowship, with additional mentorship and coordination provided by our program. So this fellowship helped advance the state's interest in kelp restoration by creating the enhanced status report. Gina Contolini, pictured here, finished her fellowship in the summer of 22, is now working currently as the kelp restoration specialist at the Gulf of the Farallones Association. And then to broaden participation of underrepresented undergraduate students interested in marine and coastal professions, we implemented the California Sea Grant undergraduate research experience to provide early career experience, training, and mentorship. We invited the research leads of the kelp recovery research program to provide paid internships to increase the participation of underrepresented students in their kelp research projects. Ultimately, 8 students completed year-long California Shore internships focused on kelp recovery research while working alongside faculty research mentors funded by this program. For communications, the primary channels for information regarding our investments in kelp are our website, newsletter, videos, and social media. And for outreach, our program is also working with multiple partners to explore aquaculture solutions for kelp restoration with pilot projects for land-based urchin ranching, which harvests urchins and feeds them in aquaculture tanks to develop the marketable roe, and evaluating purpose sea urchin culture systems and developing economic models of ranching operations. And as you heard from Kristen, the state is working to develop the kelp restoration and management plan. And so a few members of our extension team have been contracted by OPC and CDFW to support the scientific aspects of the state's KRMP and for the developing process, that which include building an understanding of the state of the science surrounding kelp and kelp restoration beyond what was in the enhanced status report, developing a process to use scientific information in decision making, and assembling and working with the Science Advisory Committee, the formal advisory body made of topical experts spanning science, local knowledge, and traditional indigenous knowledge. And California Sea Grant will also facilitate the peer review of the final draft of the KRMP. And most recently, and what the focus of this briefing is that in this last round for research grants and funding, we just partnered with OPC and Fish and Wildlife to launch 5 projects totaling over $5.8 million to generate information and capacity needed to protect and restore kelp ecosystems. The projects include best conditions and strategies to help kelp recover, and understanding resilience to warming waters in kelp and understory algal species, as well as building capacity for members of the California Native American tribes to monitor and restore kelp in their ancestral territories. For the second round of kelp research investments, the OPC provided the lion's share of the funding, investing over $5.5 million. And for the second round of this research investment, California Sea Grant is contributing $220,000 to again support the participation of 15 undergraduate students from groups that are underrepresented and underserved in marine and coastal science at the institutions listed here to be trained by faculty and research mentors on kelp research and restoration. So I'm going to conclude my overview of California Sea Grant and the ways in which we are supporting kelp restoration in the management in California with the slide of the 5 projects of the Accelerating Kelp Research and Restoration Program. The second round of investments is supporting researchers at 10 universities and research institutions in California, the Tolowa Dee-ni Nation, and 6 NGOs and 2 industry groups. And with that, I am going to introduce the first of the 3 lightning talk speakers, Dr. Jenn Caselle from UC Santa Barbara, who will provide a brief overview of not just the project for this, but also from the last round of investment.
Thank you, Shauna. If you will unshare, yep, then I can try to share here. Does that look okay, folks?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Thanks. And thanks, everyone. I'm Jenn Caselle from UC Santa Barbara, and I want to thank Assemblymember Papin and as well as her staff and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, California Ocean Protection Council, and the California Ocean Science Trust for organizing this briefing and allowing us to share some of the really exciting ongoing and also upcoming research initiatives that are addressing kelp losses that we've seen in some areas of California. So today I was tasked with telling you about this new upcoming project recently funded in this phase 2 of the program that Shauna mentioned. But this upcoming project builds very heavily on research that my team conducted in phase 1 of the kelp restoration program. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we achieved there as background. And I want to acknowledge from the outset my collaborators on this, especially Dr. Anita Espina, who's with us today, who's really taken a lead in this work and their institutions here. So as you just heard, California suffered a massive loss of kelp during that prolonged marine heat wave in 2014 to 2016, and there were significant ecological and economic consequences of that. And despite a return to favorable conditions, in some places along our coast, kelp forests have not returned. So California is increasingly seeking kelp restoration techniques as a potential tool to recover these habitats. And I will just add here too that California is taking a global lead. This is not a California-centric problem. kelp forests are being lost everywhere. And the investments and the partnership and the work and the attention that's going into kelp here in California has established us as a global leader in creating tools for restoration and conducting projects. So, but California is a pretty big state, and many of these losses were widespread, as Mike Esgro told us. And so the motivation for the work of my team is to generally provide scientific guidance to help practitioners and managers with selecting locations and times for kelp restoration. So the aim of the first recently completed project, our phase 1 project, was to produce a tool that helps resource managers and practitioners to choose optimal locations to conduct kelp restoration activities statewide. And we did this with modeling techniques. And I'm just going to briefly run you through some of the steps of this process. So we started using long-term and large spatial scale data about kelp. And this is collected primarily by long-term scuba monitoring programs. Again, Mike Esgro mentioned some of the strong commitment of our state to research, to monitoring. And we combined those into statistical models to identify the most important indicators of change in past kelp densities along the state of California. And these indicators included biological and ecological data, for example, the abundance of kelp grazers like sea urchins. It included environmental data such as temperature and nutrients that we know are important for kelp, as well as detailed descriptors of the seafloor terrain. So we established what the key indicators of kelp dynamics were, and we used those to reconstruct annual maps of kelp density across the entire state of California from the early 2000s to almost present time. So essentially, we're creating a time series of maps of kelp density. That's the second panel. And from that, we can estimate the temporal stability of kelp, so historical stability, to try to understand how variable kelp abundance is at any given site in that past period. We also used satellite imagery that Mike Esgro touched on to calculate 2 additional metrics of kelp, which were the amount of kelp loss following the marine heat wave, as well as the most up-to-date data on kelp abundance as a metric for recovery. And then the final step was to put all of those metrics together into a decision framework that identifies the different levels of priority that one might have for kelp restoration along every site of the coast, the entire California coast. So here you're just looking at a simplified plot on the left of kelp recovery versus long-term stability. And I haven't shown loss on this, but that's part of the scheme as well, loss following the heat wave. Every single dot is a site along the coast. And from the scatter, we assigned priority classes based on these important variables. Now, today, I don't have time to walk you through the entire decision tree. I will show you a link to where you can access that at the end of my presentation, but I'm going to give you one example of our logic model. So sites that have historically high levels of stability, that had very high kelp loss following the heat wave, and have shown low recovery rates following the heat wave, those would be very high priority sites for restoration. And they're shown here in the red dots, that lower right quadrant on the plot. These are generally iconic kelp beds, and if they're restored, they're likely to persist based on their historical stability. Now, I said each of these dots is a site, and so on the right is an example of what our prioritization maps look like, in this case for the Monterey Bay area. And I know it's hard to see at this scale because in our modeling, and thus in our prioritization scheme, we work at very small scales. We're prioritizing sites at 300 meters by 300 meters approximately. And we targeted that small scale because that's very close to the scale at which a restoration action might take place given our current methods. This is just an example of what the entire state of California looks like. Every 300 meters along the shoreline where kelp can live have been assigned a prioritization class based on stability and recovery. So with this information, we hope that restoration practitioners can make more highly informed decisions about where they might attempt restoration, where it might be best to continue to just monitor and watch the system, but not take active action. And importantly, where restoration might not actually be a good investment at this time. Now, it's critical to recognize that this tool will need to be used in combination with other information that wasn't considered in our modeling. For example, considerations for logistics, such as proximity to a port or safe diving conditions. You have to be able to get in the water to restore. Social ecological factors, such as maybe restoring particular kelp forests that are important to local fishing or tribal communities, as well as any administrative or legal considerations, whether the sites are in an MPA, for an example. We just model the biology and the ecology. Okay, so that work from the phase 1 project, that really formed the basis of this upcoming project that we're super excited about. And we think that is really the next step for protection and restoration of kelp in California. And that's to develop forecasts of conditions that are affecting kelp growth and survival. So this would be akin to, for example, rainfall and temperature forecasting tools that farmers might use to make strategic decisions about both planting and harvesting, to maximize their success in any given year. Forecasts will expedite smart decision-making on when and where to execute full-scale restoration interventions or defensive actions for existing or restored kelp. If you know that bad times are coming, it may be easier to protect what you have than let it go and try to restore it later. I think, the exciting thing to me is I think forecasting, it'll broaden this toolbox we have of kelp restoration strategies, and importantly, move kelp restoration in California from a situation that has been, reactive to one that is proactive. So my last slide here just shows our work plan and our conceptual model for the work and how it's based on that phase 1 project. So we will use those important indicators or drivers of kelp density that we identified from the previous project. And we can couple those with downscaled regional ocean climate models to forecast kelp abundance all the way to the year 2100. One goal of the project is long range. So in this, we want to identify future hotspots, that would be places of persistence, or cold spots, places of loss of kelp forests under changing climate. This will allow us to determine regions and timeframes that may or may not support kelp forests over the long term. And in this work, importantly, we can introduce and we can model disturbances such as marine heat waves to make our future predictions more accurate. Marine heat waves are predicted to increase in both frequency and magnitude, and they have to be taken into account in any forecasting effort. Now, a second goal is to create very high frequency predictions. This differs from the previous objective. Here we'll create very short-term kelp abundance forecasts, for example, quarterly. This will guide decision-making on restoration interventions on sub-annual or annual timescales. So basically, I think of this as a go or no-go tool for projects that are ready to implement, more akin to the farmer analogy I gave you. And then finally, we'll ensure that all of these graphical outputs and castable to anybody who needs them online in a timely way. Together, both of these projects are designed to provide very easy to understand and actionable advice on where and when kelp restoration will have the best chances of success, as well as where and when it might be best to hold off, may not be the best investment at that place or time. So I'll stop there. I said I didn't have time to go over the full decision tree. If you're interested, you can access the full report for that phase 1 project, including the maps at this QR code location. And I'd like with that to introduce the next speaker, Rosa Laucci. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. Let's see. Get my share screen. Sure. Is that good?
Yes, Rosa, that looks good.
Okay, perfect. Dalaha, Hagiyasham. Hello, good morning. My name is Rosa Laucci. I am the Marine Division Manager and Marine Biologist for Tolowa Dee-ni Nation. I just wanted to thank Assemblymember Pappen, Ocean Protection Council, California Department of Fish and Game, California Sea Grant, and Ocean Science Trust for having me here today, for having this briefing, and allowing me to present my project. So our project for, come on, my computer's slow. There we go. Our project is Gashkash Shreshki, which translates to Kelp Guardians. And kelp forests are of great importance to the nation. And although we conduct a multitude of monitoring on marine cultural keystone species, we do not yet have the capacity to engage in kelp monitoring and restoration. And just to give you a little bit of context as to where we are and the coastline that we're dealing with, this is our Aboriginal homeland map. You can kind of see at the very bottom, it's the Northern California, but the majority of it is in Oregon. So I am located in Smith River right now. So it just kind of gives you an idea of where we're working at, because not a lot of people know where Smith River is. So the primary methodology for this project will be very intensive training for Tolowa Dee-ni Nation Natural Resources staff to acquire the skills to conduct both kelp monitoring and restoration efforts. So kind of the goals of our project is to supply our Natural Resources Department with the tools that we need to develop tribal kelp forest monitoring and restoration best practices. This will also expand our monitoring plan to include subtidal and open ocean monitoring. As of right now, we're just kind of on shore. The area that we're in is a huge data gap for everything. So this will be vital in filling those data gaps in kelp research. We will produce traditional foods for our community and be able to protect our food sovereignty. And it will also support tribal youth in educational endeavors that are related to kelp restoration. And we can't do this all by myself. So we have we're going to achieve this through some really heavy collaboration with our partners. And so our partners are Sunken Seaweed, the Cal Poly Humboldt, Brow, I'm going to butcher this, I'm sure, Brow Delegar Food Sovereignty Lab, and Reef Check. And so Sunken Seaweed is a for-profit aquaculture company whose mission is to pioneer ecological seaweed farming and restoration on the West Coast. They operate a diverse seaweed farm, kelp hatchery, and tumble-culture farm in Humboldt Bay. For the Food Sovereignty Lab, we'll be working with Dr. Kutcha Riesling-Baldi. She is an associate professor and department chair of Native American Studies at Cal Poly Humboldt. The lab is a research space that upholds Indigenous sovereignty by involving Indigenous communities in shaping how their knowledge is approached, researched, engaged with, represented, and managed. And Reef Check plays a vital role in securing the health and sustainability of nearshore rocky reefs and kelp forests along the west coast of North America. By engaging with diverse volunteers, Reef Check empowers the community to contribute to these ecosystems' well-being and management. Their expert staff trains community members to be proficient scuba divers and citizen scientists, knowledgeable about local marine life, and adept at surveying kelp forests. So these three partners are going to help us meet our goals. So for Reef Check, we're going to be certifying up to 10 natural resources staff and or tribal citizens up to scientific diver level, which is absolutely incredible. They are going to supply all of the dive equipment to all the trainees, and they're going to train us in the kelp monitoring protocols that they have. And the development of these practices can later serve as a template for other indigenous communities that want to develop culturally relevant kelp forest monitoring and restoration plans within their ancestral territories. Sunken Seaweed, so they're going to be responsible for the feasibility study that we'll conduct on potential kelp farm locations within TDN ancestral territory. They're going to provide hands-on cultivation expertise by taking us out into the farms that they already have established in Humboldt Bay. And they're going to provide equipment for a tumble culture for lot, which is our word for seaweed. It's a species of pyropia that we harvest every year, and it is a keystone species and a traditional food. And so having that on hand is going to be key for our food sovereignty. And then the Cal Poly Humboldt Food Sovereignty Lab is going to enrich Tolowa students' education in kelp restoration and natural resource management. So they're going to provide an undergraduate Tolowa student with tuition to pursue a natural resource degree. They're also going to provide a graduate internship opportunity within the lab. They're going to create curriculum on kelp restoration, conduct education and outreach, engage with the Tribal Youth Council that's been established. And then they'll provide additional education opportunities through conferences, workshops, and then also field work with sunken seaweed and staff here at Tolowa Dee-ni Nation. And that's kind of a very brief overview of what our project is going to be. We're really excited. This is something that we've been wanting to do for a very long time. So a big Shanila, thank you to the funders for allowing this project to be funded. So now I'd like to pass it over to Tristin, Anoush, McHugh.
Thank you, Rosa. Hey, okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right, can you see this and hear me okay?
We can. Looks good.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tristin Anoush McHugh with the Nature Conservancy, and it's an honor to be here today to provide an overview to our project titled Accelerating Bull Kelp Ecosystem Recovery in a Recently Deforested Location in Northern California by using a strategic sequence of restoration techniques and community participation. I know it's been stated, but I must start by acknowledging the global context to which this work is placed. Kelps cover a third of the Earth's coastline, and losses are being experienced globally. Yet, our story of kelp loss in Northern California is notoriously known as an example due to the recency, severity, rapidness, and sustained losses. And this is highlighted in our first ever kelp restoration guidebook. As such, over the last few years, our team has been working with scientists all over the world to not only bring lessons learned from geographies, but also to share out what we have been learning and leading here in California, especially as it pertains to the development of the toolkit for the KRMP. And so in California, our in-water work to date has really focused on protecting and defending the remaining 4% of kelp refugia and lead in developing the tools for the toolkit through human-mediated grazer suppression and kelp enhancement. Of significance, just last year, our team developed the techniques to grow kelp from seed to reproductive adult, which was a major breakthrough. However, to date, these restoration projects for bull kelp have specifically focused on testing single independent techniques, one at a time or small scale, and have yet to combine best practices to demonstrate how an integrated science-based approach may drive and accelerate and scale restoration. And so to increase recovery success, a mosaic of in-water kelp enhancement techniques combined with grazer suppression could in fact catalyze this growth, but also a mosaic of in-water techniques and coordinated community engagement are necessary to revitalize the biodiversity, economy, and workforce opportunities. We also know that early intervention with kelp loss is key to successful restoration, ecologically and culturally. So digging into this thought and building off Jenn's model here, this once lush, high priority refugia location in Mendocino is undergoing a phase shift from kelp forest to urchin barren, and the biodiversity at this location has significantly decreased. So at the core of our work, a kelp refugia location, part of the surviving 4%, has experienced an 84% decrease in kelp canopy in the past 2 years, with this past year being the most drastic decline. The impacts of this rapid ecosystem shift the underscores and the connections between people and nature, that humans interact with the sea through experience, food, art, and storytelling. And so in the true spirit of scaling and accelerating kelp recovery, 12 multidisciplinary organizations with aligned goals and objectives will collaborate in a coordinated approach to restore and protect 5 acres of recently deforested area in Mendocino. So building off previous investments by the state and the Nature Conservancy, our project proposal advances an integrated, scalable approach to restoration by first implementing a strategic sequence of restoration techniques through grazer suppression and kelp enhancement to stimulate kelp recovery. We will harvest urchin by hand and with traps to create space and catalyze vegetative recovery through kelp enhancement practices, essentially seeding the seafloor with novel techniques, such as the Archev unit that we've designed. Second, we will be investigating sea urchin fishery adaptation and the implications for restoration and blue economy opportunities. We will work to understand how workforce opportunities have changed. And as we harvest urchin, we'll work with the fleet, individuals, private business to find uses for purple urchin through food and non-food to create a circular restoration practice. And lastly, we will be creating community participation methods to increase the likelihood of restoration success and create sustained engagement with this ecosystem. We plan to provide paid opportunities to build our North Coast scuba dive capacity. We're also hosting the first ever North Coast Kelp Fest, which I hope you all come to, which highlights food, art, science, and film. And we are working with the city of Fort Bragg and Noyo Harbor District to mobilize a blue economy for our rural community. And so despite the devastating impacts of kelp loss globally and locally, and how cold the water really is, we can't afford to lose any more forests on land or underwater. And as such, we're highly motivated to facilitate revival through these grassroots efforts that are holistic in approach and develop solutions that work for both people and place and in support of the state's initiatives. And so in closing, I would just like to thank you for the allocation of funds investment into kelp recovery research efforts, the Ocean Protection Council, California Sea Grant, CDF&W, for facilitating this award, and of course, our project team and community who work tirelessly to advocate for recovery. We're excited to get this project going and look forward to sharing our results soon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tristin. And thank you for all of our speakers for those fantastic talks. Noting time, I do want to invite all of our speakers to join me briefly back on the webinar here for our closing. We may not have time to get into any of our submitted question and answers, but as we heard today, there's a portfolio of solutions and actions being put forward by the state and the science community to really have a holistic approach to kelp recovery and resiliency. So in the last 2 minutes here, I may ask our speakers to share in their view, whether through your research or your role for the state as a funder or a management entity, what do you see as one of the most important science needs going forward, especially when considering that threats to kelp forests will only increase in intensity and frequency? And also at the same time, what are you most hopeful about for California's kelp forests looking towards the future? And so maybe keep these under brief, quick responses for each of our panelists. I may kick it back to Mike to kick us off, if that's okay with you.
You're going to make me go first, and that's a lot to put in 1 minute. I mean, there's such good questions. I think that the most pressing science need to me is the scalability of these various restoration tools that we are exploring. Scalability both in terms of space and area covered, right? But also scalability in terms of how enduring will these methods be into the future as the ocean gets warmer, as the ocean continues to change. So I think there's a lot that's encouraging about what we've tested out, and how these methods will fare in a changing ocean is kind of what still keeps me up at night. Why am I hopeful? The scale of the problem is huge and really daunting, obviously, but I am hopeful because of where we are. I mean, we're in California. We have decision makers who genuinely care about this issue. So people like me and Kristen are really privileged to work for leaders who have prioritized kelp ecosystem restoration in a world of competing priorities, including drought and wildfire and other very pressing natural resource management issues. We have the best scientific minds in the country and in the world who are devoting their brains to this problem and trying to help us find solutions. And we have the most engaged communities. I mean, the communities, California tribal nations, and also coastal communities who have been so impacted by this loss are at the table. They're coming with solutions, and they want to help. They want to be engaged. So, yeah, that's what I'm most hopeful about.
Thank you, Mike. I feel like that was a fantastic, all-encompassing answer. I guess real quickly for any of our researchers, so Rosa, Jenn, Tristin, any final last minute, last second thoughts? Yes, Jenn.
Yeah, Mike said it, and I'll say it again. I think the most important thing that we do in California is to continue to some extent doing what we're doing. The capacity, the amount of information that we have about our coastal oceans, it cannot be found anywhere else in the planet. From community and tribal-based science to academic science, and the commitment and the investment to keep all of those information streams coming in from our coastal ocean, to keep our finger on the pulse, it sets us up so well. I just want to say, though, what gives hope, or are we hopeful? Is that what the question was? Yes, of course. And the reason that I think that there's hope is because we have no choice but to be hopeful. Do we have a choice?
Absolutely.
I don't feel that way. So I'm incredibly hopeful. Our systems, our systems in this state are resilient to some extent. Things may not look like we expect them to look in the future, but ultimately we have to be hopeful, because without it, we wouldn't be on this webinar.
Couldn't say it better myself. Thank you, Jenn, and to all of our panelists. And thank you to all who stayed on past the hour and for joining us to today's briefing. Another thank you to Assembly Member Pappen for joining us earlier this morning and to sponsoring today's briefing. It is recorded and will be shared with all who registered and posted on the Ocean Science Trust website. Please get in touch with us if you have any questions. I think in chat there will be some information for you to reach out. We welcome hearing from you. And with that, thank you all and have a great rest of your day. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Sure, Shauna.